In late 2008, under gray Midwest skies and flashing gas prices, three men made a decision that said more than any press conference ever could. They drove. Leaving Detroit behind, the CEOs of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler headed for Washington, D.C., roughly 500 miles away. Each chose a hybrid vehicle, a Chevrolet Malibu hybrid, a Ford Escape hybrid, and a Chrysler Aspen hybrid. This wasn't about comfort. It was damage control. Only weeks earlier, these same executives had arrived in private jets to ask Congress for help. The backlash was immediate. Jobs were disappearing, families were tightening their belts, and corporate luxury looked completely out of touch. So this drive was meant to show restraint. But as those cars rolled out of Detroit, many Americans saw something else. Not renewal, but a company culture being forced to explain itself. And that brings up a question worth holding on to. When a giant promises change, is it real, or just what the moment demands? The answer didn't begin in 2008. It started much earlier. To understand how America's auto giants reached this point, you have to rewind to the 1960s, when the rules quietly began to shift. For decades, Detroit mastered one formula: bigger engines, more power, cars that felt limitless. Then regulation entered the picture, safety standards tightened, emissions limits followed. By the mid-1970s, automakers were required to dramatically cut pollutants like hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxides. Engines were retuned. Power was reduced. Fuel efficiency stopped being optional. The muscle era didn't vanish, but it was restrained. At the same time, something under the radar was happening. Japanese automakers were entering the U.S. market. Toyota first, then Honda, Nissan, Mazda, Mitsubishi. They didn't arrive chasing dominance. They arrived chasing reliability. Small cars, lower running costs, vehicles that asked very little of their owners. At first, Americans barely noticed. Then the oil crises of the 1970s hit. Fuel prices spiked. Gas lines stretched for blocks. And suddenly, efficiency wasn't a feature, it was the deciding factor. That's when momentum shifted. By 1980, Japanese cars weren't a niche choice. They were mainstream. Millions sold. Millions more considering them. Detroit faced a fork in the road. Fight aggressively for small, efficient cars, or lean harder into trucks and larger vehicles where profits were stronger. They leaned. Passenger cars weren't abandoned overnight, but they weren't fully defended either. Over time, that hesitation mattered. By 2006, the signal was impossible to ignore. Every single top car pick from Consumer Reports came from Japanese brands. For buyers, this wasn't about loyalty. It was about avoiding regret. Then came labor costs. Not just wages, but long-term benefits, pensions, and healthcare obligations built up over decades. Meanwhile, many foreign automakers operating in the U.S. used more flexible labor structures, making cost control easier as markets shifted. None of this broke Detroit instantly, but it weakened the foundation. So when 2008 arrived, the industry had no margin for error. Vehicle sales collapsed, dropping nearly 40% in just 2 years. For families, a new car became something to postpone. For automakers built on scale, the numbers stopped working. The housing crash made it worse. For years, homes doubled as financial cushions. By the mid-2000s, roughly a quarter of car buyers were using home equity to fund purchases. When that equity vanished, so did buying power. Factories slowed. Assembly lines paused. Automakers warned that if even one failed, suppliers, dealers, and entire regions would follow. That's when Washington stepped in. Emergency loans, tough conditions, forced restructuring. General Motors entered bankruptcy, cutting brands like Pontiac, Saturn, and Hummer. Chrysler merged with Fiat, narrowing its focus to Dodge, Jeep, and Ram. Ford avoided a direct bailout, but only by selling off Aston Martin, Jaguar, and Land Rover. Together, they made a public commitment. Smaller cars, better efficiency, a renewed focus on affordability. For a time, people believed it, but here's the turn that changed everything. What followed wasn't a return to passenger cars, it was a calculated bet on profit. One by one, sedans vanished. Ford dropped Focus, Fiesta, and Fusion. Chrysler cut the Dart and 200. GM phased out Impala, Cruze, Volt, and Malibu. This wasn't because Americans stopped needing affordable cars. It was because those cars stopped delivering the margins companies wanted. What replaced them were taller, heavier vehicles, crossovers, and trucks where pricing power was stronger. The system encouraged it. Fuel economy rules were easier, tariffs protected trucks. And legally, many crossovers qualified as light trucks, despite being car-like underneath. Over time, light trucks grew to nearly 80% of U.S. vehicle sales. And here's what buyers felt. Walk into a dealership in 2023 looking for a simple, affordable new sedan, and the choices were thin. Prices were higher. Entry points disappeared. This wasn't purely consumer preference. It was supply shaping demand. As passenger cars faded, rivals filled the gap. Trust shifted again. Recalls mounted. Reliability rankings favored familiar names, and owners shared stories that only surface after the warranty expires. Meanwhile, profits surged. Stellantis reported record earnings in 2023. Executive compensation drew scrutiny. Yet buyers saw rising prices, quality concerns, and cost-cutting headlines. At the same time, new players didn't wait. Tesla built its ecosystem from scratch and still accounts for roughly half of U.S. EV sales. Rivian carved out a premium electric truck niche. Hyundai and Kia pushed forward with steady EV launches. Then came a symbolic moment in 2024. According to new vehicle registration data from trackers like JATO Dynamics, the Toyota RAV4 edged out the Ford F-150 as the top-registered individual model in the U.S. A rare shift that stood out precisely because it challenged decades of expectations. Official sales totals still list the Ford F-Series as the overall leader when grouped together. But the signal was clear. The ground was moving. The segment Detroit leaned on most was no longer uncontested. So where does that leave the big three? They aren't gone. But they're no longer insulated from pressure. And the story isn't finished yet. Electric trucks, new partnerships, and changing rules could still rewrite the next chapter. If this breakdown helped connect the dots, hit like, subscribe for more deep dives into automotive history, and share this with someone who thinks the market always moves on its own. And one last question to close it out. 10 years from now, will General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler still stand largely intact? Or will newer players slowly take their place? Leave your take in the comments. See you next time.